This video contains descriptions of violence which may be too intense for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. In a press conference on October 17, 1994, President Bill Clinton discussed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which he signed into law in September of that year. For reasons that are still not fully understood by experts, crime rates hit their peak in the 1990s. Black communities in particular were affected. As President Clinton extolled the benefits of the bill, he mentioned the case of Eric Morse. Eric was a 5-year-old boy who lived in the Ida B. Wells housing project in Chicago, Illinois. Two other children, 10-year-old Jesse Rankins and 11-year-old Tykeece Johnson, asked Eric to help them steal candy from a store. Eric said no. Later the same evening, Jesse and Tykeece invited Eric and his brother Derrick Lemon to see their so-called clubhouse on the 14th floor of the apartment complex. When the boys arrived, Eric was attacked. Derrick tried to defend his brother, but the two other boys fought him off and were able to dangle Eric out of a window. The boys dropped Eric and he fell to his death. The case became emblematic of the deteriorating and dangerous conditions in America's housing projects. Decades of local, state, and federal policies led to a horrific but predictable reality for Americans living in the nation's most prosperous cities. From the beginning, the story of Chicago was about property. The land, which would eventually be known as Chicago, was formerly inhabited by the Miami, Sauk, Fox, and Potawatomi indigenous tribes. Illinois became a state in 1818, and non-native people flocked to the area in search of profits from rich mineral deposits. The United States leased land to miners, built a military installation, and sold plots of land to finance the construction of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Native Americans struggled to retain their land. In 1832, a Sauk warrior named Black Hawk led a force of 1,000 men, women, and children in war in an attempt to reclaim land in Illinois. The group was defeated by a contingent of nearly 7,000 settlers. By 1837, most Native Americans had been forced to move further west. Chicago was incorporated as a city when it reached a population of 4,000 people. In 1848, Chicago received its first telegraph and railroad. By 1854, the city was the world's largest exporter of grain. Even a horrible fire, which left 100,000 residents homeless, didn't stop the city's ascent. The area was quickly rebuilt. The world's first skyscraper was built in Chicago in 1885, and several more sprang up around it. In 1893, 20 million visitors flocked to Jackson Park in Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition. Black Americans also wanted a part of the city's success. World War I immigration restrictions led to labor shortages in northern industrial cities. Employers sent labor agents down south to entice Southern blacks to migrate to cities like Chicago for work. Previously, black job seekers found it difficult to secure factory work, since the unions, made up of mostly European immigrants, had negotiated with companies to reserve the best paid positions for white workers. With the flow of cheap European labor decreasing and the prospect for wartime profits increasing, business owners set aside their racial preferences. Southern farm workers made about 75 cents a day, while factory workers could earn $4 a day. In the early days of the migration, labor agents paid for the travel expenses of workers. Later, entire families saved up to send one young man up north, with an agreement that this relative would send money back home and help others follow along. Black workers wrote back home about their new life in northern cities. One worker wrote to their family, "Nothing here but money, and it is not hard to get." Businesses even used these new black laborers as strikebreakers in order to further undermine the European labor unions. From 1870 to 1920, almost 1 million black people left the southern United States. After the war ended in 1918, veterans came home, but there was no plan for their reintegration into the workforce. Wartime price controls were also lifted. Suddenly, the competition for jobs became intense, and inflation increased. The economic neglect by the government, resentment between workers, and widespread racial prejudice reared their ugly head. On July 27, 1919, a black 17-year-old named Eugene Williams and his friends were swimming at one of Chicago's beaches. A white man nearby thought that the black teenagers had crossed the invisible line that was supposed to divide black and white swimmers, and he threw rocks at Eugene. When a rock hit Eugene in the head, the teen drowned. The police refused to arrest the man responsible for Eugene's death, and a multi-day riot ensued. Law enforcement refused to intervene as white residents went into black neighborhoods to vandalize property and assault black residents. It was only on August 3rd, after the Illinois National Guard was deployed, that the riot ended. Dozens were killed and hundreds were injured. Across the country, smaller riots occurred. Activist James Weldon Johnson called the period a red summer and noted that the conflict stemmed from economic competition between blacks and whites. For those business people who sought to keep control of these cities and keep profits flowing, the solution was racial segregation. However, the Supreme Court had already blocked efforts by local governments to implement discriminatory laws. In 1917, the Supreme Court heard arguments in the case of Buchanan versus Warley, which involved a white man who attempted to sell his house to a black man in Louisville, Kentucky. The sale was blocked due to a city ordinance which forbade black people from buying homes on blocks where the majority of residents were white. The Supreme Court ruled against the ordinance, stating that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment assured to the colored race the enjoyment of all the civil rights enjoyed by white persons. In 1926, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to rule in Corrigan versus Buckley, a case which sought to determine whether a group of white homeowners in Washington, D.C. acted legally when they agreed not to sell their houses to black purchasers. Unlike the Buchanan case, which involved city ordinances, this case only involved a decision by individual homeowners. In its explanation for why they would not review the case, the Supreme Court stated that it would not intervene in cases where there was no involvement by the government. Finally, national real estate organizations saw a loophole. As long as racially discriminatory provisions were negotiated between private parties, the highest court would allow them to stand. The National Association of Real Estate Exchanges was founded in 1908 and was renamed to the National Association of Real Estate Boards in 1916. The organization borrowed a tactic developed by Nathan William McChesney of the Chicago Plan Commission. McChesney created the first so-called racial covenants, which would be included in property deeds. These covenants specified that persons of African blood or persons not of the Caucasian race would not be able to purchase, inherit, or be given possession of particular properties. The National Association of Real Estate Boards spread these covenants around the city of Chicago, effectively deciding which neighborhoods would be off limits to black residents. The northern job boom came to a screeching halt with the onset of the Great Depression. In response, new agencies and social safety net programs, referred to as the New Deal, were created to jumpstart the economy and ease unemployment. The Public Works Administration, or PWA, created in 1933, would be used to build public housing projects for low-income citizens. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, created in 1934, would provide loans to help people buy single-family housing. Both programs aimed to maintain the racially segregated status quo. The FHA used the standards developed by real estate agencies to determine which areas were good investments and would qualify for federally backed loans. In a process known as redlining, areas with a majority of black residents would be marked red and deemed unsuitable for financing, while majority white areas would be marked green and seen as financially favorable. Once it became known that black families had few, if any, mainstream financing options, unscrupulous entrepreneurs swooped in. Landlords overcharged black residents for rent while refusing to provide maintenance on the property. Many landlords took one-room units and split them into so-called kitchenettes, smaller, cramped units, which maximized profits. Other businessmen bought properties at reduced rates and then offered them on contract or contract for deed agreements to desperate black prospective homeowners. In a contract for deed agreement, a person resides in a home while they make monthly payments to pay off the price, but the person does not hold the deed. The contract holder retains the ownership of the deed and retains control of the equity amassed in the home throughout the entire payment process. Unlike a traditional mortgage, contract for deed residents are not entitled to an inspection before signing an agreement and can be evicted immediately if they miss a single payment. Unlike a traditional housing rental agreement, the resident is responsible for all maintenance, taxes, and repairs on the property. In contract for deed agreements, residents have the obligations of a homeowner without any of the benefits of home ownership. In many cases, all of the expenses cause residents to be late on payments and be evicted. No matter how long the resident has been paying on a contract, once evicted, they will not be entitled to a refund of the money they have already paid. Afterwards, the owner of the property is free to find another person to exploit. PWA housing projects were also racially segregated. The first PWA-built complex was the whites-only Techwood Homes in Atlanta, Georgia. By 1941, the all-black Ida B. Wells housing project with 1,600 units was complete in Chicago. Cabrini Green Homes, also all-black, and also in Chicago, was completed in 1942. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, dozens of other Chicago complexes were built. Dearborn Homes in 1950, Stateway Gardens in 1958, Henry Horner Homes in 1957. All of the projects were completed quickly and with cheap materials, but nevertheless, they became comfortable homes for many low-income residents. The FHA assisted low and middle-income white families in buying homes and leaving the whites-only housing projects. However, Black families continued to have few housing options. Black housing projects became overcrowded with long waiting lists, even as vacancies in whites-only complexes increased.
And I know the atmosphere that I am living in. There's so many people in the high-rise, and there are 10 families to a floor. There are 154 to 56 families to one building. To each family, there are from 2 to 10 children. You go out to get groceries, you come up on the elevator, you have to wait 10, 15, 20 minutes before you can get it. With this many people around, when the mornings you wake up, there's children up and down the gallery with the noise, knocking on your door, a couple of neighbors arguing on the gallery. At night when you go to bed, it's the same thing. You feel that there's too many families involved, too many faces that you see. You can't go in or out of the building unless you're looking into many faces. You can't go to the chute to empty your garbage unless there's a million faces in front of you. And I wonder, who are my children playing with? Who are their friends? I wonder if I can raise my boys and girls here, and they can turn out to be the type of children and young men and ladies that I have always dreamed and hoped and prayed for them to be. You can't hang your pictures like you want to. The walls are rough. You still can't paint them what you want to paint them. Someone would think that living in a high-rise building with this many family that is involved, that you wouldn't be lonely. But I feel living in a high-rise building like this, that you are very much lonely. It makes me feel as if this is not my home. This is only a place where I sleep and pay my rent. It's just like you're closed in a corner with no way out, nowhere to go.
In 1930, there were approximately 230,000 Black people in Chicago, which represented 7% of Chicago's population. By 1960, the Black population had reached 810,000 and was 23% of the population. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. visited Chicago in 1966, sparking what became known as the Chicago Freedom Movement. As he led a march in Marquette Park, his group was attacked with bricks. He commented on the incident by saying, "I have been in the civil rights movement for many years all through the South, but I have never seen, not even in Alabama or Louisiana, mobs as hostile and hateful as this crowd." The Black housing projects deteriorated. Broken lights went unfixed, trash was left on the ground, no money was set aside for repairs. Gangs formed and took control of the apartments in order to profit from illicit trade. The residents of the projects fought back. In August of 1966, 6 residents filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all residents and those on housing waiting lists. The suit alleged that the Chicago Housing Authority intentionally segregated Black residents by only building new public housing projects near existing all-Black developments. This segregation, they said, limited residents' access to public services like schools, which violated the 14th Amendment. The case would stay in the courts for almost 60 years. The National Association of Real Estate Boards changed its name to the National Association of Realtors. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1968 that racially discriminatory housing covenants, which were pioneered by the association, were illegal. With one name change, the organization sought to erase its troubled past. After the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, Black families scrambled to make up for lost time in the suburban housing market and left the inner city. Businesses moved out too. As the cost of operating in the United States increased, businesses sought cheaper markets abroad. Those who could not find jobs as lower-wage, non-union workers were left unemployed. The drug of choice in the 1960s and 1970s was heroin, which was injected intravenously. Public health officials set up methadone clinics and treatment programs to address the issue. By 1985, the rate of heroin addiction finally declined, not due to breakthroughs in addiction treatment, but because of a new, cheaper, more popular replacement: crack cocaine. The conditions that led to the popularity of crack are multifaceted. In 1981, the U.S. Center for Disease Control published an article in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, written by immunologists, that observed rare and opportunistic infections in 5 young, previously healthy gay men. Each man had several unusual infections, which led researchers to believe that their immune systems weren't working. All of the men would be dead soon after the article's publication. This early research was the first report of what would later become known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. Rumors that intravenous drug use could transmit AIDS encouraged people to avoid heroin. Meanwhile, cocaine was a drug associated with the wealthy. In order to lower the cost and increase demand, criminal organizations in Miami developed crack, a combination of small amounts of cocaine and sodium bicarbonate, commonly known as baking soda. At $5 to $20 per vial, crack was much cheaper than its pure counterpart. Each so-called crack rock contained as little as 1/10 of a gram of cocaine, and the drug offered a quick, satisfying high and was extremely addictive. Between 1982 and 1985, the number of people addicted to crack soared to almost 1.5 million. The addictive nature of the product meant irresistible profits. A small-time crack dealer can make $2,000 a month. Violent clashes increased between gangs who sought to control the neighborhood blocks which they used to sell the drug. All of the problems that were already facing the Chicago housing projects, like incarceration, child abandonment, murder, and abuse, worsened. Soon, reports of horrific crimes became national news. On June 25, 1983, an 18-month-old child named Vignette Teague was kidnapped from a hallway of Robert Taylor Home's housing project. Her parents had left her at the complex in the care of her grandmother while they went to see a movie. Approximately 50 witnesses were in the hallway at the time of Vignette's disappearance, but none were able to give details about what happened. Vignette has never been heard from or seen again. On June 10, 1985, 17-year-old Johnny Freeman was visiting Henry Horner Homes when he encountered 5-year-old Shavannah McCann. He used candy to lure her into a vacant 14th floor apartment where he raped her. After the assault, Freeman tried to throw Shavannah out of a window, but she was able to grasp the windowsill where she held on and cried out for her mother. Freeman pushed her again, causing the child to lose her grip and fall 14 floors to her death. Freeman was convicted of kidnapping, criminal sexual assault, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1992, 7-year-old Dantrell Davis was walking to school with his mother when he was hit by a stray bullet and killed. A man named Anthony Garrett later confessed that he accidentally shot Dantrell while firing towards rival gang members. Garrett was sentenced to 100 years in prison in 1994. The crime outraged the country and brought more attention to conditions in neighborhoods like those in Chicago. In 1994, when Eric Morse's killing made national news, another case hit the headlines. Robert Yummy Sandier was a 10-year-old who had been abused from birth, abandoned, and drawn into the Chicago gang life. He and his fellow gang members killed a 14-year-old girl named Siobhan Dean on August 28, 1994. Robert hinted to family members that he felt guilty and might offer information to the police about the crime. On August 31st, gang members and brothers 16-year-old Craig Hardaway and 14-year-old Derrick Hardaway took Robert to a local lot and shot him in the back of the head to prevent him from snitching. Craig was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Derrick was sentenced to 45 years in prison. In 1997, a 9-year-old girl known only as Girl X was raped, poisoned, and strangled. Her attacker wrote gang-related messages on her body and left her unconscious face down outside in the snow. The janitor who discovered the girl's body was so traumatized that he quit the next day. Girl X survived but sustained brain damage and was left blind and mute. A man named Patrick Sykes confessed to the crime and was sentenced to 120 years in prison. There is no evidence that Sykes was affiliated with any gang. He had desecrated Girl X's body in an attempt to mislead authorities. For their part, Hollywood was interested in the many stories emerging out of Chicago. The TV show Good Times depicted the working-class Evans family trying to rise above poverty while living in a Chicago housing project. While the name of the housing project isn't explicitly stated, the script heavily implies that Cabrini Green Homes was an inspiration for the show. The series ran from 1974 to 1979. The show was a breakthrough for Black actors and Black-centered storytelling on the small screen and featured a star-studded cast. Esther Rolle played the character of wife and mother Florida Evans. John Amos played the hard-working father and husband, James Evans. The 3 children of the family were Michael Evans, played by Ralph Carter, Thelma Evans, played by Bernadette Stannis, and James J.J. Evans, played by Jimmy Walker. In later seasons, character Millicent Penny Gordon Woods was played by a young Janet Jackson. Guest stars included Mary Alice, Debbie Allen, Alvin Childress, Gary Coleman, Kim Fields, and John Witherspoon. Soon, Esther Rolle and John Amos were concerned about the show's writers increasingly depicting Jimmy Walker's character JJ as an irresponsible youngster, with little attempt to use the character as a positive influence for Black youth. After angry clashes between the actors and the production team, first Amos and then Rolle departed the show. 10 years later, another TV show followed another Black Chicago family. Family Matters debuted in 1989 about the Winslows, a middle-class Black family who lived on West Brightwood Avenue. The home of the fictional Winslow family was located in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, an area above the near North neighborhood where the real Cabrini Green Homes was located. Unlike the Evans family, where the father James sometimes worked multiple odd jobs to make ends meet, Carl Winslow, played by Reginald Vale Johnson, had a stable job as a Chicago police officer. His wife Harriet, played by Jo Marie Payton, worked various jobs including elevator operator at a newspaper and vice president of sales at a department store. The couple had 3 children: Eddie Winslow, played by Darius McCrary, Laura Winslow, played by Kelly Williams, and Judy Winslow, played by Jamie Foxworth. Midway through the first season, a character named Steve Urkel, played by Jaleel White, guest starred as the Winslows' nosy, nerdy neighbor. Though the character was only supposed to appear on the show one time, Urkel's performance was a hit with the audience, and writers quickly made him a permanent cast member. Eventually, more episodes focused on Steve Urkel and his numerous alter egos, while less emphasis was placed on the family overall. After season 4, the Winslows' youngest daughter, Judy, was abruptly and completely dropped from the cast to make more room for the character of Steve Urkel. Family Matters was on TV for 9 seasons, and at the time was the second longest running TV sitcom with a predominantly Black cast. The Jeffersons was the longest running. It was also the last show that debuted in the 1980s to leave the air in the 1990s. On the big screen, there was more opportunity to explore the violence plaguing Chicago's residents. and the 1992 horror film Candyman. The spirit of a lynched black man terrorizes the residents of Chicago's Cabrini Green housing projects. The white protagonist in the movie initially believed that the legend of Candyman was developed by the residents to cope with the poverty and violence they face daily. They eventually discover that Candyman is real. The film was a critical and commercial success. It is widely considered a classic in the horror genre. A book entitled Hardball: A Season in the Projects was published in 1994. It tells the story of a white man named Daniel Coyle who agrees to coach a majority black baseball team composed of players who live in Chicago's housing projects. In 2001, the movie Hardball, based on the book, was released in theaters starring Keanu Reeves as the lead character. The movie was a box office success. In the world of situational comedy, conflicts only last for an episode, and all characters get a happy ending. In cinema, gritty, violent dramas were most profitable. It seemed that few media outlets were interested in hearing about the nuanced reality of Chicago life from the people who lived there. In 1983, Maureen Woodson founded the Henry Horner Mothers Guild. From the time she moved into her unit in 1975 with her 4 children, Woodson had protested the neglect and inadequate maintenance by CHA, whom she called the biggest slumlord in the city. Starting in 1986, the Mothers Guild received funding from Chicago nonprofit organizations, which allowed them to open a small office and begin their community organizing. They started gang intervention programs, cleanup campaigns, and applied pressure to the city to move abandoned cars, repair broken lights, and tear down abandoned buildings. The Guild was also able to hire a professional community organizer named Kim Bobo. Bobo had experience working with other public housing tenants to push for important changes at their complexes. Bobo and the Guild forced the CHA to replace broken locks, fix elevators, and fix a first-floor common space, which was later used for after-school programs. Despite the improvements, Bobo felt more substantive changes were needed. In May of 1991, the Mothers Guild filed a lawsuit against CHA, accusing the city of violating building codes and breaking the terms of its leases with tenants. It had taken more than a year to gather tenant statements and lay the foundation for the lawsuit. The suit explained that CHA intentionally allowed the deterioration of vacant apartments, which became centers of the drug trade and violence. Some buildings had hundreds of units, but only 20 people were living there. Everything in the abandoned units would be torn out and the hallways would be dark. CHA officials testified that they were told not to renovate units once residents moved out. Once the building reached 50% vacancy, CHA was legally allowed to demolish it, evicting the few tenants who remained. The plaintiffs therefore argued that neglect of housing units was tantamount to demolition of the buildings. Bobo enlisted the help of Bruce Orenstein, executive director of the Chicago Video Project, to create a press campaign. The group strategically crafted a media message around 2 themes. One, that the CHA had broken promises to the residents of Henry Horner. 2, that the CHA should be held to the same legal standard as other Chicago landlords.
So I moved in 72, me, my husband, and I had 2 kids then. It was clean. The stairwells were clean. There were lights. We had a baby playground and a big playground. There were benches, grass. It was beautiful. I mean, it was really nice.
20 years later, life at Henry Horner has changed. To a passerby, it's hard to tell whether the buildings are occupied or abandoned. The janitors no longer live in the buildings like they used to, and so repairs are made very slowly, if they're made at all. Simple things like light fixtures, plumbing, laundry facilities haven't been fixed in years. It took over 12 months just to replace a mailbox. Do you ride the elevator or take the stairs? If the stairways are lit, it's safer than taking the elevator. But the hallways are dark so often, the children growing up think that's just the way it's supposed to be. And so now, represented by the Legal Assistance Foundation of Chicago, they're filing a class action lawsuit against CHA for excessive code violations and vacancy rates as much as 70% in some buildings. The Henry Horner Mothers Guild believes that CHA should be held to the same legal responsibilities and standards as other Chicago landlords. They believe that it's wrong for their children and families to have to live like this.
Ornstein's team provided media training to the mothers and leveraged his contacts to ensure that the Chicago Tribune was given the exclusive rights to the story. The video news release was successful. The story of Henry Horner and the Mothers Guild was told in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Washington Post, ABC World News Tonight, CBS This Morning, and the Oprah Winfrey Show. Despite this national coverage, very little changed in the housing complex. Kim Bobo and Bruce Ornstein had warned the mothers ahead of time that media coverage alone would not bring about change. The purpose of the campaign was to continue to push for smaller concessions and to inject morale and commitment into the larger effort to hold CHA accountable. One positive result was that the campaign changed the perception of the residents by the public. They were not passive victims with no hope of redress, but instead were strong, organized citizens who were willing to fight for what they deserved. Nevertheless, the cameras eventually went away and the story dropped out of the headline. The Mothers Guild was a small group with no full-time staff and no source for continuous large donations. The group did not have the organizing capacity to seize upon the media coverage to push for concrete results. The media coverage also didn't accelerate resolution of the lawsuit. It dragged on for years as CHA filed numerous motions to dismiss. In 1991, the same year the lawsuit was filed, the Mothers Guild dissolved after allegations of financial mismanagement. All but one guild member, Annette Hunt, moved out of the housing complex. Hunt stopped organizing for the Mothers Guild, but still worked on issues related to the lawsuit. In 1993, two teens who lived in the Chicago projects, Lealyn Jones and Lloyd Newman, collaborated with a local public radio host to create a segment called Ghetto Life 101. The project included self-tape interviews between the two youths and project residents. In 1994, the pair collaborated again on a project entitled Remorse, which included interviews with residents about the killing of Eric Morse. The recording contains the only known interview with Eric's mother, Toni Morse. The project won the grand prize Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award and a Peabody Award in 1995. Experts agree that the initial effort to construct housing projects focused almost exclusively on providing physical accommodations without any of the supportive social services. The concentration of poverty in specific areas led to crime and violence, which in turn made those areas unattractive for investment. This destructive cycle was difficult to disrupt using traditional welfare programs alone. In the early 1990s, plans were made to revitalize public housing projects around the country. The Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere, or HOPE, program was introduced by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also called HUD. In 1995, U.S. HUD assumed control over the Chicago Housing Authority. The new HOPE program would convert housing projects to mixed-income developments. However, the new mixed-income developments only reserved a small percentage of new apartments for low-income residents. HUD promised help for residents to relocate, but observers were skeptical. The HOPE plan had three main objectives. First, to replace dilapidated housing units in part or in whole. Second, to spur investment in the surrounding neighborhoods. Lastly, to decrease the segregation and concentration of low-income families in any given area. Through these initiatives, the program hoped to create more sustainable communities where poor residents were able to receive support and improve their situations by being integrated into the city's larger economy. Residents had few options. They could attempt to secure a spot in the new mixed-income housing development by passing a detailed screening process. They could use a housing voucher, also known as a Section 8 voucher, to find housing in the private rental market. Housing vouchers require the resident to pay up to 40% of the rent, while the remaining amount is paid to the landlord with federal funds. Another option was for residents to move to another housing project with vacancies. As a last resort, residents could exit subsidized housing completely. The results of the HOPE program were mixed. Two studies were funded by HUD to assess living conditions amongst those actively living in housing projects and to track the status of those who left housing projects due to revitalization efforts. Over 60% of respondents said their new housing was in good or excellent condition. Over 80% of former housing project residents reported that their new housing was at least as good, if not better, than their previous unit. Most also said that their new neighborhoods had a lower concentration of poverty. However, about 40% reported that crime and violence in their neighborhoods was still a concern. The study also highlighted significant barriers to housing for low-income families. Mental and physical health problems occurred more frequently amongst populations that lived in housing projects than amongst those who were impoverished but lived elsewhere. More than 1/3 of adults reported chronic illnesses like diabetes, high blood pressure, or arthritis. Likewise, children tended to have worse health. 20% of children living in housing projects from the ages of 6 to 12 had asthma. For younger children, the prevalence was 25%, more than 3 times the national average. Residents were also more likely to have a history of criminal convictions, drug abuse issues, domestic violence allegations, and a poor credit history, which reduced the likelihood of securing housing in the private market. For those who did secure apartments in the private market, they were more likely to struggle with paying for food, utilities, and other expenses, which had previously been subsidized when they were living in the housing project. Some had to share apartments with other families. Others reported having to move more frequently. Another challenge is that the pace of development for affordable apartments has remained far behind demand for decades. Vouchers could not solve these problems for the residents surveyed because many of them had complex needs and severe barriers to employment. Public housing was the option of last resort for the so-called hard-to-house populations who would require supportive services for many years, even if they were able to relocate to a better living area.
There's a lot of customs, there's a lot of traditions, there's a lot of things that were passed on mouth to mouth, chest to chest, face to face.
This is where I'm connected. This is where my family is. This is where my roots are. This is my home.
It was home, and without it, some of us would not have had a home. On February 2nd, 2000, we were told that our homes would be torn down.
Public housing in Chicago is about to change today.
I didn't really believe it. Then I thought, where am I going to go?
Now, under this new plan, 51 buildings will be demolished. Thousands of
There were a lot of mixed emotions. You were glad that you were going to get better housing, but you weren't sure if the better housing, when it arrived, you were going to be one of the residents that was living there.
Things did change. Our homes came down. In their place, new neighborhoods grew up with beautiful apartments and condos. Stateway Gardens became Park Boulevard, and Madden Wells became Oakwood Shores.
Welcome to my home. It was good for the environment and good for the kids because the apartments we got now is beautiful.
Some of us moved back into new neighborhoods, but most of us didn't.
When people realized everybody wasn't going to have a right to return, then it became a feeling of uncertainty. A lot of people started falling through the cracks.
And a lot of them got evicted, homeless and what have you, because they weren't prepared for this outside life.
They say the plan for transformation is a big story for Chicago. It's a big story for its community leaders, developers, and politicians.
This is the largest transformation of public housing in the world.
But most of all, it's a big story for us, the residents of public housing who have struggled and lived through it all.
In 2011, the last buildings of the Cabrini Green and Ida B. Wells housing projects were destroyed. Interestingly, the benefits of the Henry Horner Mothers Guild became evident decades later. Throughout the various demolitions of other housing projects around the city, Henry Horner residents retained more power and suffered less displacement because of the agreements reached through the lawsuit filed by the Mothers Guild. The feeling amongst residents was bittersweet. The projects had been a place of violence and trauma, but they had banded together and formed networks to survive. Like the buildings which once housed them, The support systems they had built to survive adversity were destroyed. In 2014, the media announced that the Obama Presidential Center would be built in Chicago in honor of America's 44th President, Barack Obama. The center will be a multifunctional campus with a museum, exhibition spaces, meeting areas, a garden, an auditorium, food services, and a 5,000 square foot public library. It's estimated that the center will host 700,000 visitors per year, create 5,000 direct and indirect jobs, and have a $3 billion impact on the city of Chicago. The location for the complex will be the infamous Jackson Park, the same location which hosted the World's Columbia Exposition over 100 years ago, and the same location which borders many of the majority Black areas where the original housing projects were located. Developers committed to ensuring that over 50% of subcontractors were diverse, and 35% of the workforce were from the South and West Side of Chicago. But local activists and residents were not convinced. The Obama Community Benefits Agreement Coalition, or Obama CBA Coalition, worked for over 5 years to secure additional guarantees aimed at keeping low-income residents in the area and allowing them to benefit from the influx of investment. The coalition focused on the Washington Park, Woodlawn, and South Shore neighborhoods. These are areas in which 70% of residents have an annual income of less than $50,000, and 50% of residents pay more than 30% of their wages in rent. In 2020, the coalition and the city reached an agreement. The City Council passed the Woodlawn Housing Preservation Ordinance, which had several provisions, including a $1 million home improvement grant program, which would allow homeowners to apply for $20,000 grants for use towards home safety and repair, a $500,000 commitment to the Renew Woodlawn program, which is aimed at helping low-income renters purchase homes, and a provision to allow renters a first right of refusal if their landlord decides to sell a residence apartment building. In 2019, a settlement was reached in the lawsuit filed back in 1966 against the Chicago Housing Authority. Among other stipulations, the agreement required the CHA to provide early learning programs for residents at no cost and to cooperate with continuous monitoring. If the CHA successfully completed the settlement requirements, the case would be completed in July of 2024. As of August 2024, the case has been extended for 3 additional years as requirements for 6 sites are still to be completed. The home featured in the opening credits of Family Matters was scheduled for demolition in 2017. The developer who owns the property plans to replace the home with 3 condominiums. To honor the property's history, they plan to decorate the exterior of the new development with photos of the original house and the Family Matters cast. The history of housing in Chicago continues. The past is torn down and replaced with new promises for the future. In the book Hardball, the main character reflects on his time coaching the kids from Chicago's projects. He says, "That's the story of Cabrini. A well-meaning person shows up 3 times a week, but nothing changes."